Everyone, thank you so much for having me here today as we mark the second anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution. I'm still trying to get past Judge Cather's remark that in history, women with college degrees have troubled uteruses. Because if someone with 5 degrees, my uterus is very, very troubled. I'm going to explain that to my kids when I go home. Anyhow, so interestingly enough, as we mark this important moment in history, we're finding ourselves asking again and again, what about women? What about women's rights? What about the role of women in society? And most importantly, what about the role of women in politics? And the relationship to the state, and most importantly, to state power. And so what I want to focus on today is women vis-a-vis the state. Asking what does the state, and especially state power, mean for women and women's rights, and why is it so important for us to get this right now? Because we have to get it right now because we're still in the birth of this new chapter of the country where the Constitution is finalized, hypothetically, and the new government is about to form. So what I hope to do today is frame our discussion in a historical and a theoretical context. And second, to make some suggestions that these are points that I hope that we are aware of, that we look forward towards the future, especially in the next few months, especially before, during, and right after the parliamentary election and first parliamentary session. So while we all remember January 25th, 2011 as the start of the Egyptian Revolution, it was on January 21st, a couple of days before the revolution, that a video posted by a student, Asma Mahfouz, a guest of the AESA, two Octobers ago. Yes. And in this video, she speaks straight to the camera, and she holds up a sign saying, I'm going to go out and protest, and I'm going to go to try to bring down the Mubarak regime, and I'm going to reclaim the dignity and the honor of her fellow Egyptians. She says, as long as you say there's no hope, there will be no hope. But if you go down and take a stance, then there will be hope. In it, she challenges men, and this is the interesting thing. She's challenging men, and who are watching the video, and she says, I'm going to fight for your freedom. I'm going to fight for your dignity. And if you're real Egyptians, if you're real Muslims, then the least you can do, if you can't go and fight for yourself, is come and fight for my honor to fight for you. And so this is a real challenge. It's a real challenge to men, and I'm going to focus on this challenge to men, and I'm going to return to this challenge about the protection of dignity and honor in a few minutes. And so throughout this Arab Spring, the beginnings of the revolution, the first couple of months, which are quickly, as we all watched yesterday, turning into the Arab winter, we saw images of protesters that were coming from all walks of life, all social strata, women across the ideological spectrum, coming together and really chanting for this one hand, with the aim of toppling a very well-entrenched and well-encrusted, deep-seated authoritarianism. Women amassed at the front lines of the protests in Cairo's Tahrir Square, and if you remember the first images that emerged, they were of women coming face to face with the security apparatus, right, with the riot police. And so the first images of combat actually were of women. But when the state decided to respond right away, their first targets were women. So the state chose to target women. Women were subjected not only to attacks, but also having their chastity questioned, right? Questioning their honor. When the military attacks subjects 18 women protesting in Tahrir Square to humiliating virginity tests, what are they referred to, if you remember, right? These are not daughters of the nation, right? Daughters of the nation would not be in the street. They would not be sleeping in tents. They don't represent your country, they are dogs. And so in essence, what are these kinds of people? Young, unchaste women who are fighting for your rights? So in many ways, there's a challenge to who exactly is protesting. And this is a direct attack, again, at the heart of society. At the heart of society, triggering this call for social dignity and maintaining the status quo. Those girls in the streets leading your so-called revolution are doing what? They're not real Egyptians. reflecting real Egyptian societal values. And of course, you can't forget the young woman who becomes known as the blue-browed girl, who was beaten and stomped on by helmeted riot police, who became the symbol of the Egyptian protesters calling for the end of military rule. So there's a target up here towards young women. This was not the first time the state had responded to protests by targeting women protesters. In 2005, the Mubarak regime strategically began using sexual violence against women. In May 25th of 2005, otherwise known as Black Friday, it was a day of protest against a national referendum which was meant to extend the presidential term for President Hosni Mubarak. The state responded by having security officers attack 3 prominent journalists, 3 female journalists who had been stripped out of their clothes. Remember, 2005 was a historic parliamentary moment, right? There was the beginning of the opening in 2005. And this is before the election. And so the state uses a very specific targeted attack to instill fear in the people. When you attack your women, the bearers of cultural and social identity and dignity, your mothers, your daughters, your sisters, and you can't do anything about it, oh people, oh men of society, then this is the heart of authoritarian control. This is where we see social control through targeted attacks on women. And in this case, the message is not only to people, but also to the press, because independent media was starting to challenge the regime. So by targeting female journalists, you're also in many ways silencing the press. Why does the state target women in protest movements? Even if a protest doesn't have a gender dimension. It's because attacking women is a form of social control. The state can attack women in a sea of men, then ultimately society is powerless. And this is part of the pathology of authoritarianism, social control of society through the woman. When we remember the then President Hosni Mubarak's interview with Christiane Amanpour, it happens February 3rd, just 8 days before the end of his reign, he says to her, "You don't know these people like I know them." And this is part of that very same pathology, this patriarchal, pathological authoritarianism that I am the one who knows and you do not know, and so I must be the one who's in control. The weapon for control in this way is able to accomplish 3 things: to humiliate, to instill fear, and to stop protest, but also to intimidate and silence. And so this is by design. The reason why there is major parity on those indicators is this is by design. So the fight for democratic rights has been exposing in the past 2 years how social control is embedded in authoritarian pathology, of the dominance of the public sphere, underscoring the contradictions that women are facing in this struggle. And while the literature on women as agents of political and social change highlights these struggles as a negotiation of the constructions of gender, women as symbols of protest find themselves in a really interesting predicament and power struggle, where they are the symbols of change, but they're also symbols of perceived instability. And so think about this. Women are symbols of change, but symbols of instability. And so symbols of change and consequently instability, they become the very targets for the state, not only for dominance and control, but for control of the public sphere. So Egypt has historically enshrined this also on another level. The Egyptian legal code follows one model, except in the case of personal status laws, the Qawanin Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya. Laws issues that deal with marriage, divorce, child custody, these are left up to interpretation. Over time, this site, personal status law, is increasingly becoming the site of contestation with the state. Between people in the state, by separating personal status laws from the rest of the civil code or civil rule, ultimately what's happening is the government is separating this in terms of the state. Society is separate from the civil laws, and ultimately the separation of laws goes back into the, doesn't go back to the 1915, 1920, 1929 constitutions. It begins in the 1940s, but it's during the 1970s when the Jahan Sadat laws are passed that these come to the fore. These reforms were incorporating new grounds for divorce by a woman and extending the rights of women to be able to divorce. It also redefined child custody. And so we see that historically in these constitutional debates over women, it's really about what is the role of society vis-a-vis